Thumb, 1880, the city, consumed by the forest. What if an entire town simply stopped existing? Not after a war, not after a famous disaster, but quietly, as if it had never truly belonged to the world in the first place. In the late 1800s, Steinhatchee appeared on maps, in records, and in hopeful plans, and then, just as silently, it faded. No farewell, no final headline, only forest, water, and unanswered questions. In 1880, Steinhatchee was supposed to be a promise, a small but strategic settlement carved into the rugged coastline of Florida's Big Bend, where rivers met dense wilderness and opportunity seemed to whisper to anyone willing to listen. Timber, fishing, transport routes, new land waiting to be claimed. On paper, it made sense. On the ground, it was something else entirely. Isolation wrapped the town like a second skin. Thick forests pressed in from every direction. The land was wet, unstable, alive in ways that resisted control. People came anyway. Families, laborers, traders, names now barely legible in old documents. They built homes, paths, rudimentary infrastructure. They believed permanence was only a matter of effort. But Steinhatchee never felt settled. It felt temporary, even while it existed. The river flooded without warning. Mosquitoes carried sickness. Supplies arrived late or not at all. The forest did not retreat. It watched. What makes Steinhatchee unsettling is not just that it failed. Many towns failed in the 19th century. But makes it disturbing is how completely it slipped from collective memory. Census mentions thin out. Maps change. Mentionsistopi, there is no single event recorded as the end. No fire described in detail. No evacuation or to preserve, just absence. A gap where life once tried to root itself. Imagine living there in those final years, waking to the sounds of insects and water, the air heavy, the future uncertain, each season more difficult than the last, crops struggling, trade unreliable, illness lingering, decisions made in whispers. Do we stay one more year? Do we leave now while we still can? Or did something happen that forced the decision all at once? Something never properly written down. The forest remembers differently than people do. Where streets once cut through the land, roots now twist. Where foundations were laid, soil reclaimed them. Nature did not destroy Steinhatchee in a single dramatic moment. It absorbed it, slowly, methodically, without witnesses. That kind of disappearance is harder to accept because it offers no clear ending. Today, if you stand where Steinhatchee once stood, there is no sign welcoming you, no plaque explaining what was lost. Only trees, water, and silence. And silence has a way of feeling intentional, as if something is being withheld. The question is not only what happened to Steinhatchee, but why its story fractured so completely that even history seems unsure how to speak about it. Because cities usually leave scars, ruins, graves, records. Steinhatchee left almost nothing. And that absence is the first clue that this story is not about failure alone, but about how certain places resist being remembered at all. If this story already feels unsettling, that reaction matters. Stories like Steinhatchee are not just about a place vanishing, but about how history decides what deserves to be remembered and what is quietly erased. Take a moment to really process what you just heard. Understanding these disappearances requires attention, curiosity, and context. If this mystery is pulling you in, leave a comment sharing what you think happened to Was it slow abandonment? A silent catastrophe? Or something history chose not to record? Make sure to like the video so this investigation can reach more people, and subscribe to the channel if you want to keep uncovering forgotten cities, lost communities, and the secrets buried beneath forests and time. Steinhatchee was never built in an easy place, and that choice shaped everything that followed. On late 19th century maps, the town sat near the mouth of the Steinhatchee River along Florida's Big Bend coast, a region that looked promising from a distance but proved unforgiving up close. To investors and planners in the 1870s, the location suggested access to timber waterways for transport, fishing grounds, and a gateway between inland resources and coastal trade. On paper, it appeared logical. On the ground, it was hostile. The Big Bend. Coastline is not like the postcard beaches farther south. It is a maze of marshes, dense forests, shallow rivers, and unstable land. The soil shifts. Water levels change without warning. Seasonal floods blur the line between river and settlement for a small town dependent on consistent transport and predictable land. This environment demanded far more than the settlers could give. Roads were primitive or non-existent. Wagons sank into mud. Supplies depended on tides, weather, and boats that could easily be delayed for weeks. Isolation was Steinhatchee's defining condition. Unlike towns connected by rail or major routes, Steinhatchee existed at the edge of infrastructure. News arrived late. Medical help arrived later. When illness spread, there was nowhere to send the sick. When crops failed, there was no fast alternative source of food. When storms came, there was no external system to help rebuild. The town had to survive entirely on its own strength in a place that steadily drained it. The forest surrounding Steinhatchee was not passive scenery. It was dense, aggressive, and alive with threats settlers did not fully understand. Mosquito-borne diseases like malaria and yellow fever were common in swampy coastal regions during that era. Timber had to be cleared constantly, just to keep structures standing. Vegetation reclaimed land almost as fast as it was cut. The forest did not retreat when humans arrived. It pressed closer. Weather amplified the problem. Hurricanes and tropical storms were poorly predicted in the 19th century. A single storm could wipe out docks, flood homes, destroy food stores, and undo years of labor overnight. Even lesser storms soaked the ground, rotted wood, and weakened foundations. Each rebuilding effort cost more energy, more time, more resolve. Over years, that cost accumulates psychologically as much as physically. What makes Steinhatchee's location especially troubling is that it offered no clear escape. Leaving meant traveling through wilderness or unreliable waterways. Families could not simply pack up and reach another town in a day. Decisions to stay or go were heavy and slow. Many likely waited too long, hoping conditions would improve. Some may have left quietly, one household at a time, until the town hollowed out without anyone formally declaring it abandoned. This geography explains why Steinhatchee did not collapse in a dramatic moment. It eroded, it weakened, season by season. Isolation delayed outside awareness of its decline. By the time officials or mapmakers noticed, there may have been little left to record. A place that was hard to reach became easy to forget. Standing back, the question becomes unsettling. Was Steinhatchee doomed the moment it was placed there? Or did human optimism push people to ignore what the land was already telling them? The environment did not attack suddenly. It waited, and that patience may be what erased the city so completely before. Steinhatchee vanished from maps. There were people who believed deeply in its future, to understand why they stayed as long as they did. We have to look at who founded the town and what they hoped to gain from a place that resisted them from the very beginning. Steinhatchee did not emerge by accident. Like most frontier settlements of the late 19th century, it was the result of belief, speculation, and quiet ambition. The people who founded it were not chasing mystery or isolation. They were chasing opportunity. Florida, in the decades after the Civil War, was widely advertised as a land of second chances. Cheap property, untapped resources, a future waiting for those willing to endure hardship long enough to claim it. The earliest settlers of Steinhatchee were drawn by three promises: timber, water access, and expansion. The forests surrounding the river were thick with valuable hardwoods and pine, resources that northern industries demanded in growing quantities. Rivers were the highways of the era, especially in regions where rail lines had not yet arrived. A settlement near a navigable river could, in theory, float logs downstream, move goods, and connect itself to larger trade networks without the cost of building roads or rail infrastructure. On paper, Steinhatchee looked like a foothold, a place that could grow into something larger once enough people committed to it. Early land claims suggest a mix of small farmers, timber workers, traders, and families seeking permanent roots. These were not transient laborers expecting to leave quickly. They built homes, cleared land, and invested years of their lives. That alone tells us something important. Steinhatchee was not meant to be temporary, but belief can be blinding. Many of the founders came from places where land behaved differently, where soil held firm, where forests retreated when cut, where rivers followed predictable rhythms. Steinhatchee offered none of that stability. The river flooded unpredictably. Timber extraction proved more difficult than expected. Transport was unreliable. What was advertised as abundance required far more labor and resilience than anyone anticipated. There is also the economic reality to consider. Frontier towns often depended on outside capital and long-term patience before turning profitable. Steinhatchee may never have reached that threshold. Investors and land speculators who expected quick returns likely withdrew quietly when progress stalled. Without sustained financial backing, the burden fell entirely on residents. When repairs were needed, they paid. When tools broke, they waited. When illness struck, they endured. Social structure matters in survival. And Steinhatchee's population was likely too small and too strained to maintain cohesion under constant pressure. Frontier towns that survived usually did so because they reached a critical mass, enough people to support schools, churches, doctors, merchants, and collective labor. Steinhatchee appears to have hovered just below that line, too big to abandon immediately, too small to stabilize. There is another layer that history rarely records clearly: fear. Living in an isolated settlement surrounded by dense wilderness carried psychological weight. Nights were long, sounds unfamiliar, medical knowledge limited, rumors traveled faster than facts. When a few families left, it may have planted doubt in those who remained. When sickness appeared, it may have felt like a sign. These slow, internal fractures do not show up in official records, but they shape outcomes. What makes Steinhatchee especially haunting is that its founders did what generations before them had done successfully elsewhere. They followed rivers. They trusted land claims. They believed effort would eventually be rewarded. In many places, that faith was justified. In Steinhatchee, it was not. The land did not adapt to them. They were forced to adapt to the land. And over time, many simply could not. By the time the town began to fade from records, its founders were no longer pioneers chasing opportunity. They were people facing hard decisions about survival, and when those decisions were made, they were made quietly. No declarations, no announcements, just movement away from a place that had stopped giving anything back. Yet even as people left, something remained behind, slowly tightening its grip on what they had built. To understand how Steinhatchee disappeared so thoroughly, we have to look at the force that never left, the forest itself, and how it became the city's most patient enemy. Steinhatchee did not fall to fire, invasion, or a single recorded catastrophe. It fell to something far more patient: the forest. In the late 1800s, the wilderness surrounding Steinhatchee was not a backdrop. It was an active force, constantly pressing inward, testing the limits of human presence. Every structure built in that town existed in negotiation with nature, and nature never stopped renegotiating the terms. Clearing land in Steinhatchee was not a one-time effort. Trees grew fast in the humid climate. Underbrush returned within months. Vines crept across paths. Roots cracked foundations. Wooden structures rotted quickly under constant moisture. Homes, fences, docks, and storage buildings required near constant repair just to remain functional. The labor never ended, and exhaustion accumulated year after year. The forest also reshaped the town's boundaries. Areas once used for farming became unusable as soil waterlogged or eroded. Fields reverted to wild growth. Trails vanished beneath vegetation. What had once been familiar routes turned confusing and dangerous. This erosion of space affected more than logistics. It altered how people felt inside the town. When the land around you no longer feels stable or predictable, permanence becomes an illusion. Disease intensified the pressure. Dense forests and stagnant water created ideal conditions for mosquitoes, which carried illnesses settlers barely understood. Fever outbreaks were common in coastal Florida during this period. Without doctors nearby and with limited medical knowledge, sickness could spread unchecked. Even surviving an illness left families weakened, unable to keep pace with the physical demands of frontier life. The forest also concealed danger. Predators, venomous animals, and unseen hazards made daily tasks riskier. A simple trip to gather wood or hunt could turn fatal. Each incident reinforced the sense that Steinhatchee was not being reclaimed from wilderness, but merely tolerated by it. And tolerance can be withdrawn. As the forest reclaimed abandoned homes and unused paths, the town began to lose its shape. A city without clear edges stops feeling like a city at all. Community fractures when distance grows between households, when visibility decreases, when shared spaces vanish. People retreat inward. Communication slows. Isolation deepens even among neighbors. Perhaps most disturbing is how quietly this happened. There was no dramatic collapse, no final stand. The forest did not announce its victory. It simply kept growing. And each year, Steinhatchee shrank, not necessarily in population at first, but in spirit. When people talk about abandonment, they often imagine a sudden decision. In places like Steinhatchee, abandonment is a process. One repair not made. One house left empty. One family gone. Eventually, the balance tipped. Maintaining the town required more energy than living elsewhere. Leaving became less dangerous than staying, and once enough people made that choice, the forest accelerated its work. Roofs collapsed, floors sank, roads disappeared. Within a generation, Steinhatchee was no longer a visible settlement. It was a rumor beneath the trees. This explains why so little remains today. Nature did not preserve Steinhatchee as a ruin. It erased it, and that erasure complicates the historical record, because historians rely on structures, artifacts, and continuity. When the forest consumes all three, what remains are fragments and silence, yet silence itself can be revealing. The lack of clear documentation suggests something else at work beyond environmental pressure alone. As Steinhatchee faded physically, its story also fractured on paper. Records became incomplete. Accounts stopped abruptly. To understand why, we need to examine the documents that survive and the ones that do not. If Steinhatchee had burned in a single night or been wiped out by a named disaster, history would have marked it clearly. There would be reports, dates, official language describing loss and recovery. Instead, what survives on paper is something far more unsettling, a slow thinning of information, followed by silence. Records do not describe an end. They simply stop paying attention. Early mentions of Steinhatchee appear in land claims, Gezernal maps, and sparse administrative references. Names surface briefly attached to parcels of land or small transactions. Then those names vanish. Census listings grow vague. Some years omit the settlement entirely. Others mention the region without acknowledging a town at all. It is as if Steinhatchee slipped between categories, no longer important enough to record, but not officially gone either. This kind of documentary disappearance is rare but revealing. Governments document places that matter economically, strategically, or politically. When a settlement stops producing value, it can quietly fall out of the system. No announcement is required. Clerks stop asking questions. Map makers redraw borders. Printers remove names to make space for places that still generate revenue or population. The absence itself becomes the record. What complicates Steinhatchee's case is that no replacement town immediately took its place. Usually, abandoned settlements are overshadowed by nearby growth. A new port opens, a rail line diverts traffic, a larger town absorbs the population. In Steinhatchee's case, the region remained sparse. There was no successor demanding explanation. The area simply reverted to being wilderness with a river running through it. Personal records, diaries, letters, church logs are almost entirely missing. That absence suggests either extreme isolation or rapid displacement. Families who left may have moved in different directions, fragmenting the narrative. Without a shared destination, there was no shared memory. No single community carried Steinhatchee forward in its stories. It died not only physically, but socially. Maps tell their own quiet story. Early cartography sometimes includes Steinhatchee as a point of interest. Later maps erase it or reduce it to a river name alone. Rivers remain. Towns do not. This transition hints that the settlement lost relevance before anyone thought to document its decline properly. By the time someone might have asked what happened, there was no one left to answer. This pattern raises uncomfortable questions. Did officials know something they chose not to emphasize? Or was the disappearance so gradual that no single moment felt worthy of record? In frontier regions, tragedy did not always prompt documentation. Disease outbreaks, internal conflicts, starvation, or quiet evacuations often went unreported, especially when they affected small, remote populations. Another possibility lingers beneath the surface. Some events are not ignored accidentally. They are allowed to fade because they complicate preferred narratives. Stories of failed settlements challenge the mythology of expansion, resilience, and inevitable progress. It is easier to let a place like Steinhatchee dissolve into the background than to confront why it could not survive. The result is a historical vacuum. A city that existed just long enough to leave traces, but not long enough to explain itself. This vacuum invites speculation, but it also demands caution. Silence can hide mundane failure, but it can also hide trauma. Without clear documentation, we are forced to read between absences. And when history grows quiet like this, the most important clues are often not what is written, but what abruptly stops being written. That is where Steinhatchee becomes more than a forgotten town. It becomes a question, one that grows heavier the longer it remains unanswered. If the records go silent, the land sometimes speaks instead. What lies beneath Steinhatchee's soil may tell us more than any document ever did. When Steinhatchee finally emptied, it did not announce itself. No official evacuation, no recorded decree, just people leaving until no one was left to say they had gone. This is what makes the disappearance of its population so disturbing. Towns usually die loudly. Steinhatchee died quietly, and that quiet leaves room for questions that history never resolved. One possibility is gradual abandonment, a slow, rational decision repeated household by household. As conditions worsened, families may have concluded that staying no longer made sense. One family leaves after a bad harvest, another follows after illness, a third goes when supplies fail to arrive. Over time, the town hall is out. This explanation is logical, but it does not fully account for how quickly Steinhatchee vanished from records. Gradual abandonment usually leaves a trail. This one barely does. Another possibility is sudden pressure, a convergence of factors that forced people to leave within a short window of time. Disease outbreaks were common in swamp-adjacent settlements in the 19th century. Malaria, yellow fever, and other fevers could spread rapidly and terrify small communities. If several families fell ill at once, panic could have accelerated decisions. In places without doctors or medicine, survival often meant leaving immediately. Environmental shock is another candidate. A major flood, series of storms, or prolonged seasonal failure could have destroyed food supplies and homes simultaneously. If Steinhatchee suffered such an event without outside witnesses, the population may have fled en masse. Without newspapers nearby or officials present, the event would leave little documentation. What survives would be absence. There is also the human factor. Frontier settlements lived under constant psychological strain. Isolation, fear, rumor, and exhaustion erode cohesion. If internal conflict emerged, disputes over resources, leadership, land claims, or survival strategies, the town could fracture quickly. Some leave early, others stay too long. Trust collapses, community dissolves. These moments rarely make it into official history, but they shape outcomes decisively. What is especially unsettling is that no nearby town recorded an influx of Steinhatchee refugees that suggests dispersal rather than migration. People did not leave together. They scattered. Some may have gone inland, others by river. Some likely died along the way. A scattered population leaves scattered memory. No shared story survives to be passed down. This absence of witnesses is key. When everyone leaves separately, no one carries the full truth. Each person knows only their fragment, and fragments, over time, fade. This is how entire communities disappear without myth or memory, not through a single tragedy, but through disconnection. By the time the last residents left, Steinhatchee was already half reclaimed. Houses weakened, paths overgrown. The forest erased evidence quickly. Anyone returning years later would find little proof that people ever lived there in meaningful numbers, without ruins to anchor memory. The town slipped into obscurity. Yet people leave things behind, even when they flee. Objects, foundations, tools, and some of those buried and hidden would resurface later in unexpected ways. Long after the last residents vanished, Steinhatchee did not fully disappear. It sank beneath layers of soil. Roots and sediment fragments of the town remained, sealed away by the same forest that erased it from sight. These remnants are not dramatic ruins rising from the ground. They are subtle, unsettling traces that surface only when disturbed, as if the land itself decides when to reveal them. Occasional discoveries have hinted at what lies below. Pieces of worked wood, hand-cut timber, rusted metal tools, and fragments of foundations have been found buried where no modern structures ever stood. These are not items washed in from elsewhere. They are precisely where a town would have been. Aligned, intentional, human. The problem is that without standing structures, these finds are easy to dismiss or overlook, written off as debris rather than evidence of a lost settlement. The soil in the Big Bend region is dynamic. Flooding layers sediment quickly. Organic matter decomposes fast in the humid climate. What might remain visible for centuries in drier regions can vanish in decades here. This means Steinhatchee's physical history was compressed. Houses did not decay slowly into recognizable ruins. They collapsed, rotted, and were swallowed whole. Floors sank. Walls fell inward. Roofs disintegrated. The forest finished what abandonment began. What makes these buried remains unsettling is their silence. Archaeologists often rely on patterns, cemeteries, streets, foundations that tell clear stories. Steinhatchee offers none of that easy. There are no known graveyards marked or recorded, no central structure identified conclusively. That absence fuels darker questions. Were people buried elsewhere? Were deaths unrecorded? Or did those who left take their dead with them, leaving no physical memory behind? Some evidence suggests hurried departure. Objects that would normally be reclaimed, tools, cookware, personal items, appear to have been left behind. In planned relocations, people carry what they can. When leaving under pressure, they abandon what slows them down. These scattered artifacts imply urgency at the end. Even if history never documented the cause, the forest itself acts as a barrier to deeper investigation. Dense growth, protected lands, and shifting waterways make systematic excavation difficult. Unlike famous lost cities, Steinhatchee lies in a place that resists exposure. Digging risks environmental disruption. Flooding can undo months of careful work in days. As a result, much of what lies beneath remains untouched. Not because it lacks importance, but because reaching it is costly and uncertain. This creates a strange imbalance. The town existed, people lived, worked, struggled, and left. Evidence exists, yet the story remains incomplete because the land refuses to cooperate fully. It keeps its own record, one written in soil layers rather than words. Every buried object becomes a question rather than an answer, and buried things have a way of resurfacing when no one expects them to. Floods uncover fragments, construction reveals foundations. Erosion exposes outlines that briefly resemble streets before vanishing again. Each glimpse reminds us that Steinhatchee is not gone. It is concealed. Understanding what the forest hides forces us to confront a deeper truth. Some places are not meant to be remembered, and when memory fades, imagination rushes in to fill the gaps. That is why Steinhatchee does not stand alone. It belongs to a larger pattern of places lost in nature, forgotten in similar ways, yet each with its own unsettling details. Steinhatchee feels unique because it vanished so completely, but it is not alone. Across history, there are towns and villages that followed a similar path. Places built with confidence, sustained briefly by hope, and then quietly erased when nature proved stronger than planning. What connects the Steinhatchee to these other ghost cities is not a shared cause, but a shared vulnerability. Consider settlements established at the edge of swamps, deltas, floodplains, or dense forests. They often rose during moments of economic optimism when resources appeared limitless and environmental risks were underestimated. Like Steinhatchee, many depended on waterways rather than roads, believing rivers would guarantee access and prosperity. And like Steinhatchee, those same rivers later became agents of instability, flooding, isolating, and erasing. What sets Steinhatchee apart is the speed with which it disappeared from collective awareness. Other abandoned towns left visible skeletons, stone churches, brick foundations, cemeteries that refused to be hidden. Steinhatchee did not. Its materials were organic, wood, earth, simple construction, the forest consumed these efficiently, leaving no monument to failure. In this sense, Steinhatchee represents the most extreme outcome of a familiar pattern. There is also a psychological similarity. In many of these lost towns, abandonment did not come from a single dramatic decision. It came from fatigue, from the slow realization that effort no longer produced stability. People stopped rebuilding after floods. They stopped clearing encroaching vegetation. They stopped believing that next year would be better. When belief collapses, a town dissolves from the inside out. Comparisons reveal another unsettling truth. Places that vanish this way rarely become legends immediately. They become blank spaces. They are too ordinary to romanticize, too unsuccessful to celebrate. They fall between categories, not heroic tragedies, not cautionary tales formerly taught, just failures absorbed by the land. Steinhatchee fits this pattern precisely. In some cases, these locations are rediscovered decades later and reframed as mysteries. Archaeologists find foundations. Locals tell half-remembered stories. The narrative forms backward. Steinhatchee never fully reached that stage. Its rediscovery has been partial, fragmented, and uncertain. That leaves its story suspended, neither fully lost nor fully recovered. Seeing Steinhatchee alongside other forgotten settlements reframes the question. It is not only what happened here, but how many places like this disappeared without anyone noticing? How many communities were swallowed by forests, marshes, or deserts because they failed quietly rather than catastrophically? This perspective makes Steinhatchee less of an anomaly and more of a warning. When human ambition meets an environment it cannot dominate, the outcome is often not drama, but erasure. And erasure is harder to resist, because it leaves nothing obvious to fight against. That brings us to the most unsettling layer of all. When facts thin out and patterns emerge, theories begin to form. And Steinhatchee, surrounded by silence and fragments, has inspired more than a few. When documentation fails and physical evidence stays buried, theory takes over. Steinhatchee's disappearance has never been fully explained by a single confirmed cause, and that uncertainty has opened the door to interpretations that range from practical to deeply unsettling. These theories persist not because they are sensational, but because the known facts leave too much unanswered. One theory centers on a severe disease outbreak that was never properly recorded. In the late 19th century, outbreaks of malaria, yellow fever, and other mosquito-borne illnesses could devastate small coastal settlements. If Steinhatchee experienced a rapid spread of illness, fear alone could have triggered mass flight. In isolated areas, deaths were often buried quietly, if at all, and records were rarely centralized. A population could collapse before authorities even became aware. Another theory suggests environmental collapse rather than a single event. A sequence of floods combined with failed harvests may have rendered the town uninhabitable within a short span of years. Without stable food or safe shelter, residents may have reached a breaking point simultaneously. What makes this plausible is the absence of rebuilding. People did not return. Once they left, Steinhatchee was abandoned completely. Some historians consider economic abandonment the most likely explanation. If timber extraction proved less profitable than expected and transport routes shifted elsewhere, Steinhatchee may have lost its only economic justification. In frontier regions, once investment dried up, settlements often collapsed fast. Without trade, isolation becomes fatal. This explanation is practical, but it does not fully explain the lack of transitional records. More disturbing interpretations focus on internal collapse. Conflict within the community, disputes over land, leadership failures, or violence could have fractured trust beyond repair. In small settlements, unresolved conflict can escalate quickly, forcing families to leave under threat rather than choice. Such events were often deliberately left undocumented to avoid legal or reputational consequences. Local oral traditions add another layer. Some speak of the area as unlucky, a place people were warned against settling. While such language is often dismissed as folklore, it reflects lived experience. People do not abandon functioning towns because of superstition alone. Beliefs usually grow from repeated hardship and fear, passed down informally long after facts are forgotten. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that Steinhatchee's end was simply not considered important enough to record. Frontier life produced countless failures, and not all of them earned historical attention. If Steinhatchee was seen as a failed experiment rather than a tragedy, its disappearance may have been allowed to fade without explanation. What unites all these theories is not certainty, but absence. Each tries to account for why an entire community could vanish without leaving a clear trail. None fully succeed, and that failure is the point. Steinhatchee resists closure. It refuses a neat ending. The forest reclaimed the land, records went quiet, memory fractured, and what remains is a question mark in the historical landscape, a place that reminds us how fragile permanence truly is. Which leads to the final question: why does Steinhatchee still matter now, long after the last footprints were erased? Steinhatchee no longer exists as a town, but it has not stopped existing as a warning. What happened there forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about history. Disappearance does not always come with drama, and erasure does not require catastrophe. Sometimes places vanish simply because the world moves on and no one insists on remembering them. Steinhatchee matters because it exposes the fragile contract between human ambition and environment. In the 19th century, expansion was driven by confidence. Maps were drawn first. Promises followed. Reality came last. Steinhatchee shows what happens when the land does not cooperate, when nature does not negotiate, and when optimism outpaces preparation. It reminds us that not every failure announces itself loudly enough to be preserved. It also matters because of what it reveals about memory. History is not a complete record of the past. It is a filtered one. Towns that succeed leave archives, buildings, descendants, and celebrations. Towns that fail quietly often leave nothing but gaps. Steinhatchee sits inside one of those gaps, and gaps are dangerous because they allow repetition. Modern societies still build invulnerable places, floodplains, fire zones, coastal edges, regions that appear profitable until conditions shift. When those places fail, the narrative often sounds familiar. Unexpected environmental stress, economic withdrawal, gradual abandonment. The difference is that today we tend to notice. In Steinhatchee's time, failure could dissolve without witnesses. There is also a human cost hidden in that silence. Families lived there. Children grew up there. People made choices that shaped the rest of their lives based on Steinhatchee's promise. When the town disappeared, their stories scattered with them. No monument records their effort. No cemetery marks their presence clearly. The forest erased not only structures, but identity. That is why Steinhatchee feels unsettling even now. It challenges the idea that history naturally preserves what matters. It shows that significance can be lost not because it was small, but because it was inconvenient, isolated, and unsuccessful. Andati. Realization forces us to ask what else has been erased in similar ways. Steinhatchee survives today only as fragments. A river name, buried remains, uncertain records, and questions without firm answers. But those questions are valuable. They remind us that disappearance is not the same as insignificance. Some places vanished precisely because they were fragile, and fragility is part of the human story. The forest won, but it did not tell the story. That responsibility falls to us. And once we look closely, Steinhatchee stops being just a ghost city. It becomes a mirror, reflecting how easily entire communities can slip out of history when no one is watching closely enough. If you stayed until the end of this story, you are now part of the small group of people who refuse to let Steinhatchee disappear one more time. Stories like this only survive when they are shared, questioned, and remembered. Take a moment to leave a comment and write Steinhatchee was how if this story changed. The way you see forgotten cities, your comment helps keep these lost places alive in the conversation. Make sure to like the video to show your support and subscribe to the channel for more deep investigations into ghost cities, vanished communities, and the hidden stories history never fully explained. And before you go, watch the next video appearing on your screen right now. It uncovers another place that vanished without warning, and the truth behind it is just as unsettling.